My sister, who was supposed to be dead, came to my wedding, but the truth she told shocks you. So, I think my entire life just fell apart, and it happened in the most dramatic, gut-wrenching way possible. At my own wedding. Everything was supposed to be perfect. The venue, the guests, the warm golden glow of the afternoon sun streaming through the windows. I was standing at the altar, heart pounding in excitement, watching my soon-to-be wife, Rachel, looking like an actual angel in her dress. We were about to exchange vows, the moment we had been planning for over a year. And then, just as the officiant was about to speak, the chapel doors burst open. It was loud, loud enough to make everyone jump. A few guests gasped. Someone in the back muttered, "What the hell?" At first, I thought maybe it was a mistake. A late guest? Someone who got lost on the way in? But then I saw her. A woman stepped inside, her heels clicking against the wooden floor, and my heart stopped. She wasn't just some random stranger. She looked exactly like me. I don't mean in a weird coincidence kind of way. I mean exactly like me. Same sharp jawline, same deep-set eyes, even the same anxious way I tucked my hair behind my ear when I was nervous. For a second, I thought I was hallucinating. Maybe the stress of the wedding had finally made me lose my mind. The room had gone completely silent. My mother clutched my father's arm so tightly, her knuckles turned white. My dad's face, already flushed from a few too many pre-ceremony drinks, turned an alarming shade of red. Rachel's grip on my hand tightened. Her voice was barely above a whisper when she asked, "Who is she?" I had no answer. The woman took a shaky breath and stepped forward. Her voice trembled slightly, but it carried across the hushed room. "I'm sorry for the interruption, but I need to talk to the groom." Whispers spread through the crowd like wildfire. Some guests were leaning forward, eyes darting between her and me, putting the pieces together. My best man, Jake, shot me a "What the hell is going on?" "Look." I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. Who are you?" The woman's lip trembled, and she hesitated for a moment before saying, "My name is Emily. I think I'm your sister." The words slammed into me like a freight train. Number, that wasn't possible. I had a twin sister, but she died at birth. My parents told me that. I grew up with that knowledge, lived my whole life believing I had lost a sister I never got to meet. I mourned for her. So, why was she standing in front of me now? I turned to my parents, expecting them to immediately deny it, to say this was some insane mistake. But my mother's eyes were glossy with tears, her breathing uneven. My father was stiff. His fists clenched so tightly his knuckles were turning white. He didn't even look at me, and that's when I knew. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't some crazy coincidence. They had lied to me. And now, my entire world was about to come crashing down. For a few seconds, I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. My whole body just locked up. Emily, my sister. The sister I was told died at birth. It felt like my brain was short-circuiting, trying to process the impossible. Meanwhile, the entire wedding hall was frozen in stunned silence. Rachel was gripping my arm now, her nails digging into my skin, like she was afraid I was going to collapse. My best man, Jake, had his jaw hanging open. My mother looked like she was about to faint. My dad was just staring at the ground, his face blank. And Emily? She was watching me, her expression flickering between anxious hope and gut-wrenching sadness. Finally, I managed to force out the only words that came to mind. "This has to be some kind of mistake." Emily swallowed hard, blinking rapidly like she was trying to keep herself from crying. Then she shook her head. "It's not." Her voice was firm, steady, like she'd been preparing for this moment for a long time. "I know this is shocking," she continued. "I know you have no reason to believe me. But I promise you, I wouldn't be here if I wasn't absolutely sure." I could barely breathe. I turned to my parents, waiting, begging for them to say something. Anything. My mom let out a soft, broken sound. A sob. She covered her mouth with one hand, shaking her head. And my dad? He just sighed. A long, heavy sigh. Then, in a low, gritted voice, he muttered, "We only wanted one child." The words hit me like a gut punch. What? Emily flinched too, like she had just been slapped. "Excuse me?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. My dad exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple like he was the one dealing with a headache. Like he was the victim here. "It was easier this way," he muttered. "We weren't ready for two kids. It was too much. So we made a choice." I stared at him, horrified. "A choice?" I repeated. "You mean you just got rid of her?" Emily let out a shaky breath. "They didn't just get rid of me," she said, and then she dropped the real bombshell. "They sold me." The room exploded. Gasps, murmurs, a few sharp curses from Rachel's side of the family. The officiant just awkwardly took a step back, like he wanted absolutely no part in this. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. "That's insane," I said, shaking my head. That can't be true. That's not true. Tell me she's lying." My voice was desperate now, begging my parents to say something, anything that would make this make sense. But my mom was sobbing into her hands. My dad? He just clenched his jaw and stayed silent. And that silence was my answer. I stumbled back a step, feeling like I might throw up. Rachel caught my arm. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Oh my God, this is real." Emily took another cautious step toward me. "I only found out a few months ago," she said quietly. "The couple who raised me, they weren't my biological parents. They finally admitted it after I started asking questions. I hired a private investigator, got my original birth records. That's how I found you. That's how I found them." She shot a look at my parents, her expression a mixture of rage and grief. "I didn't come here to ruin your wedding," she continued. "I didn't even know if I should come, but I had to meet you, even if it was just once." I was shaking. My whole body was shaking. I turned to my parents one last time, barely able to get the words out. "How could you do this?" My dad finally looked up. His expression wasn't guilty. It wasn't remorseful. It was just cold. It was for the best. And that was the moment I knew. I would never look at them the same way again. The room was dead silent for about 3 seconds. Then, chaos. Rachel's mom stood up, her face twisted in rage. "You sold your own child? What kind of monsters are you?" Guests started whispering, murmuring, full on freaking out. Some were gasping in horror, others pulling out their phones, probably texting their friends, because, let's be honest, this was the kind of scandal that nobody could keep to themselves. Meanwhile, my dad just stood there, arms crossed, his face unreadable. My mom was still crying into her hands, her shoulders shaking violently. And me? I was just numb. Emily had just told me, told everyone, that my parents sold her, like she was some inconvenient piece of furniture. And instead of denying it, instead of defending themselves, my dad's only response was, "It was for the best." For the best? My stomach twisted. I felt Rachel rubbing my arm, whispering my name, asking if I was okay, but I barely heard her. All I could do was stare at the two people who raised me and wonder if I had ever truly known them at all. Emily swallowed hard and turned to my dad, her voice surprisingly steady despite the storm raging in her eyes. "Tell them the truth," she demanded. "Tell them what you did." My dad's jaw tightened. He took a slow breath through his nose, like he was trying to calm himself down. And then, finally, he spoke. "You have no idea what it was like back then." A bitter laugh escaped Emily. "Oh, please. What? You had to sell me? Were you struggling? Were you poor?" I already knew the answer. We were never poor. My dad worked in finance. My mom was a stay-at-home parent. We had a nice house. I went to private school. We weren't drowning in money, but we were never struggling either. And yet, they got rid of Emily. My dad's nostrils flared. "We weren't ready for two kids," he muttered. "Your mother had a hard pregnancy, and we knew we couldn't handle it. Then we were approached by a couple who couldn't have children of their own. They made us an offer, and we took it. Rachel's father, a big, intimidating guy who rarely ever spoke, stood up so fast his chair screeched against the floor. "You sold your own kid for money?" His voice was dangerously low. My dad flinched. "It wasn't like that," he said quickly. "It was an arrangement. They wanted a baby, and we—" "You what?" I cut in. My voice was ice. "You decided I was the better one, so you just tossed Emily away?" My dad's mouth opened, then closed, and then he made the mistake of trying to justify it. "We did what was best for you, too," he said, looking directly at me. "You had a good life. You had opportunities. Would you really have wanted to grow up with a struggling family, competing for resources, fighting for attention?" I felt sick. "Are you seriously trying to make me feel grateful for this?" I asked, my voice rising. "You're acting like you did me some kind of favor. Like you weren't just two selfish people who decided I was worth keeping and she wasn't." Emily's lip trembled, but she quickly pressed it into a thin line, forcing herself to stay composed. Rachel's mom spoke up again, her voice shaking with rage. "So, let me get this straight," she said. "You didn't just put her up for adoption. You sold her to the highest bidder and erased her from your lives. Lied to your own son about it for nearly 30 years. And now you're standing here, trying to justify it?" She turned to Rachel. "Honey, I don't think I want to be in the same room as these people." Rachel looked at me, eyes wide, waiting for my response. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't looking at my parents as my parents. I was looking at them as strangers. I took a slow, deep breath. Then I turned to Emily. "I don't know you," I said honestly. "But if you're my sister, you deserve the truth. And I want to hear everything you know." My mom let out a choked sob. My dad's eyes flashed with something dark. "Be careful, son." His voice was a low warning. I held his stare. "No," I said. "You be careful." Because I'm not letting this go. My dad's warning hung in the air, but I wasn't scared. I was done. For 27 years, I believed my sister was dead, that I was an only child, that my parents were good people. Now, in the span of 5 minutes, I had found out they were liars who sold their own daughter like she was an inconvenience, and they had the audacity to stand there and act like they were the victims. I turned to Emily. "I want to hear everything," I said. "Every single thing you know." She took a deep breath, nodded, and reached into her bag. She pulled out a folder, thick, worn, full of documents. "I came prepared," she said, her voice calm but laced with something heavy, "because I knew they'd try to deny it." My dad stiffened. "Emily?" "Shut up," I snapped. His eyes flashed, but I didn't care. For once in my life, he wasn't in control of this conversation. I was. Emily opened the folder and pulled out a birth certificate. "This is mine," she said, holding it up. "My original birth certificate, before it was changed." I stepped closer. There, listed under parents, were my mom and dad's names. I heard my mom let out a choked sob behind me. My dad's face stayed blank, but I could see the tension in his jaw. Emily wasn't done. She pulled out another document. "This," she continued, "is the adoption paperwork. But not just a normal adoption. See that?" She pointed to a financial record. "That's a donation of $50,000 sent from the couple who raised me to your parents, dated 2 weeks after I was born." Rachel gasped. Someone in the crowd cursed under their breath. I felt like I was going to throw up. "So, it wasn't even a struggling couple who wanted a baby?" I asked, my voice hollow. Emily shook her head. They were rich. Very rich." She swallowed. "They couldn't have kids, and they wanted a newborn. Your parents saw an opportunity." I turned back to my father. "You sold her for 50 grand?" He finally met my gaze. "It was a different time," he said, like that excused everything. "We made a choice. And we never looked back. Emily flinched. I saw red. I stepped forward, getting right in his face. Never looked back? I repeated. You never even wondered what happened to her? He sighed, rubbing his temple like I was the one being difficult. She had a good life, he muttered. Better than we could have given her. I turned to Emily. Was it? Her lip trembled. She exhaled shakily. I had things, she admitted. A nice house, a private school. But my adoptive parents, they weren't good people. She hesitated, then added in a voice barely above a whisper. They weren't kind. A chill ran down my spine. My dad shifted uncomfortably. He knew, and that's when it hit me. They knew what kind of people they were giving her to, and they still went through with it. I turned back to him, rage boiling under my skin. You knew, didn't you? My voice was cold. You knew they weren't good people, but you took the money anyway. My dad's jaw twitched. It wasn't that simple. It was exactly that simple, I shot back. You didn't care. As long as you got what you wanted, one kid, no extra burden, and a nice fat check, you didn't care what happened to her. My mother was sobbing now. My father? He just stared at me. And then he said something that made my blood run cold. You need to let this go, son. I took a step back. Let this go? Let this go? I felt like I was drowning. Rachel grabbed my hand, grounding me. She looked at me with wide, heartbroken eyes, silently telling me she had my back. Emily clutched her folder, blinking rapidly, trying not to break down in front of all these people. And my parents? They just stood there, waiting for me to drop it. They expected me to just move on, like they did. Like they had when they walked out of a hospital with one baby, instead of two, and never looked back. I clenched my jaw, my heart hammering in my chest. I wasn't letting this go. They weren't walking away from this unscathed. Not this time. I stood there, staring at the two people who had raised me, fed me, tucked me into bed at night. People I thought I knew. But they weren't my parents anymore. They were just two strangers who had lied, sold their own child, and expected me to let it go. I took a deep breath. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat, but my voice came out calm, steady, final. I want you both to leave. My mother let out a strangled sob. Please, honey. I shook my head. Number, you don't get to cry. You don't get to stand here and pretend to be hurt when you're the ones who did this. My dad scoffed, shaking his head in disgust. You're being dramatic. That was it. That was the moment I knew there was nothing left to salvage. Dramatic? I repeated, my voice dangerously low. You sold your own daughter, lied to me my whole life, showed zero remorse, and now that you're exposed, you're calling me dramatic? I laughed bitterly. You know what? Fine. Maybe I am. But at least I'm not a monster. The room was dead silent. I turned to Emily, my chest tightening when I saw the pain on her face. She had come here hoping for answers, for closure. She had gotten so much worse. I took her hand gently. You don't have to stay here, I told her. You don't have to deal with them anymore. She let out a shaky breath, nodding. I never planned to. I turned back to my parents one last time. You're dead to me. My mother collapsed into a chair, sobbing uncontrollably. My father's expression finally cracked, his lips pressing into a tight, bitter line. But he said nothing. He knew. They had lost me. They had lost everything. I turned back to Rachel, who was already motioning to security. Within seconds, two staff members approached my parents. One of them cleared his throat awkwardly. Sir, ma'am, I think it's best if you leave. My father's fist clenched. He looked at me like he wanted to say something, maybe to fight back, maybe to beg, but he didn't. He just grabbed my mother's arm and stormed out. Just like that, they were gone. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then Rachel squeezed my hand. Are you okay? I exhaled slowly, my whole body still buzzing with adrenaline. No, I admitted, but I will be. I turned to Emily, who was watching me with a mix of sadness and relief. I could see it in her eyes. She thought I'd pick them over her, that maybe, in the end, she would lose me too. I pulled her into a hug. She froze for a second, then hugged me back, tight. "You're not alone anymore," I whispered. She let out a shaky breath, gripping my shirt like she was afraid to let go. "Neither are you." Rachel smiled, squeezing my arm. Jake clapped me on the back. The guests were still in shock, but they were starting to relax, murmuring among themselves. "And me?" I turned back to the altar. "So," I said, forcing a small smile at Rachel, "still want to get married?" She laughed softly. "Of course I do." And just like that, we did. My parents lost everything that day. But I gained a sister and a family worth fighting for.